She rode 3 days through freezing mountain passes to deliver a dead man's letter, and what that letter said nearly made her turn around and never come back. A woman alone on the frontier in 1887 had two options: find protection or get destroyed. Eliza Hartwell had always been too proud for the first and too stubborn for the second. But pride doesn't pay debts, and stubbornness can't stop a bank from taking everything your father bled to build. So when she found that final letter tucked inside her father's Bible, a letter addressed to a man most people in the territory refused to name out loud, she made a choice that would either save her life or ruin what was left of it. If you're watching this for the first time, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one goes deep. The horse nearly gave out on the second day. Eliza Hartwell knew it before the animal did. That subtle hitch in the gelding's stride, the way his ears dropped when they should have been forward, reading the terrain. She'd grown up around horses. Her father had taught her to watch for that particular kind of quiet. When a horse goes quiet, he used to say, pay attention. They don't suffer in silence unless they're truly suffering. She dismounted on a frozen shelf of rock above a creek bed that had gone mostly to ice and walked the last 4 miles into the lower foothills on foot, leading the horse by a rope she wrapped twice around her wrist so she wouldn't lose him if he spooked. The temperature had dropped during the night and hadn't recovered. Her breath came out in short white clouds. Her boots? Good boots. Her father's, actually, stuffed with an extra pair of wool socks to keep them on her feet, crunched through the thin crust of overnight snow with every step. She hadn't eaten since the morning before. There had been a pouch of dried apples in her saddlebag, but she'd given most of them to the horse somewhere around the second creek crossing when he'd started planting his feet and refusing to move forward. Stubborn animal. She couldn't really blame him. If someone had offered her dried apples and a good excuse to stop moving, she might have taken it too. The letter was in her coat pocket. She'd checked it so many times during the ride that the outer envelope had gone soft at the corners, worn down by the repeated press of her fingers through the wool. She hadn't opened it. It wasn't addressed to her. It wasn't hers to open. But she'd held it so often that she felt like she could almost read the words through the paper. Her father's handwriting on the front, the name he'd written there. Gideon Mercer. She'd never met the man. She knew the name, of course. Everyone in a 2-county radius knew the name, usually in the same way they knew the names of hard winters and flash floods and other things that could hurt you if you got too close. Not that anyone could point to something specific Gideon Mercer had done. It was more the accumulated weight of a dozen half-told stories passed around bunkhouses and general stores and church socials. They say he once ran a man off his land at gunpoint. They say he broke someone's hand in a card dispute down in Caldwell. They say he doesn't want neighbors and doesn't want company, and if you ride onto his property without an invitation, you'll know about it before you get within shouting distance of his cabin. Her father had known him. That was the part she couldn't fully reconcile. Edmund Hartwell had been, by every account she'd ever heard and every memory she carried, a decent and careful man. He'd been respected in the territory. People came to him for advice. He'd served 2 terms as a land committee representative and never once been accused of anything worse than occasional stubbornness. And in his final weeks, when the illness had hollowed him out and left him mostly confined to his bed, he'd written a letter to Gideon Mercer. A letter he'd made Eliza promise to deliver in person. "Don't send it," he'd said. His voice by then was barely a voice, more like dry paper moving against itself. "Write it there yourself. Look him in the eye when you give it to him. Don't let him turn you away before he reads it." She hadn't asked what was in it. She'd been too frightened of the answer and too focused on the desperate arithmetic of his breathing, trying to count each exhale and will the next one into existence. By the time she understood that asking questions was something she should have done, it was too late to ask them. He died on a Tuesday in October, while the leaves on the cottonwoods outside his window had gone yellow and were beginning to let go. She'd buried him, settled what she could of his affairs, discovered the full scope of what she couldn't settle, and then she'd saddled the horse and headed north. The Mercer place was not easy to find, which she suspected was intentional. The direction she'd gotten from a woman at the last trading post, a weathered, efficient woman named Mrs. Drummond, who'd dispensed the information with the same brisk economy she used for everything, as if words were goods she charged by the unit, had been accurate but terse. Follow the canyon road north until you see the split pine. Take the left fork. Don't mistake the creek crossing for the road. The cabin is set back from the tree line. You won't see it until you're practically on top of it. She'd found the split pine. She'd made the correct choice at the fork, though it had taken her a moment of standing in the cold, weighing her options. She'd crossed the creek, ankle deep, ice cold, soaking through her boots in the few seconds it took the horse to pick across, and then she'd emerged from the tree line into a clearing and stopped. The cabin was bigger than she'd expected, not large exactly. It was still a frontier homestead, not a ranch house, but it was built with a kind of intention that the structures of struggling men usually lacked. The logs were tight. The chinking between them looked recent. There was a covered porch running along the front with 2 posts that someone had taken the trouble to square properly. A woodpile stacked against the eastern wall that reached nearly to the roof overhang, split and stacked with the obsessive neatness of a man who took the work of preparing for winter very seriously. Behind the cabin, she could see the dark outline of a barn, larger than the house, and beyond that what looked like hay storage and a secondary structure she couldn't identify at this distance. There was smoke coming from the chimney, and there was a man standing on the porch, watching her. She didn't know how long he'd been there, long enough that he wasn't moving toward her, just watching, one shoulder against the post, arms not quite crossed, a stillness about him that she recognized as something practiced rather than natural. The stillness of a man who'd learned that moving first could be a mistake. She took a breath, let it out, squared her shoulders, a habit she'd inherited from her father, that reflexive gathering of herself before something hard, and walked the horse forward. Up close, Gideon Mercer was not what she'd pictured. She'd constructed a version of him in her head during the 3 days of riding, partly to occupy herself, and partly out of some instinct that it was better to be prepared. The mental image she'd assembled from the fragments of stories had been large, rough, visibly dangerous. A man who looked the way his reputation felt. He was tall, she'd gotten that right. And the roughness was there in the way that years of outdoor work embedded itself into a person's hands and face and posture. But he was lean rather than broad, with the kind of angular build that suggested everything unnecessary had been stripped away by the life he lived. His face was weathered but not old. She put him somewhere in his mid-30s, which matched what she'd been told, with dark eyes that were watching her with an attention she found simultaneously reassuring and unsettling. He wasn't looking at her the way some men looked at a woman traveling alone. He was looking at her the way a careful person looked at anything unexpected that arrived on their property. Assessing. Not threatening, but not welcoming either. He had a rifle leaned against the wall beside him, she noticed. His hand wasn't near it, but it was there. She stopped the horse about 20 feet from the porch. "Mr. Mercer," she said. His chin moved, barely. An acknowledgement rather than a greeting. "My name is Eliza Hartwell. Edmund Hartwell was my father." She reached into her coat pocket, keeping her movements deliberate, slow enough that they couldn't be misread, and pulled out the envelope. "He asked me to bring you this." Something shifted in his expression at her father's name. It was small and quickly controlled, but it was there. A flicker of something. She couldn't tell if it was grief or surprise or something else entirely. "Edmund's dead," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. 3 weeks ago." He looked at the envelope in her hand. Then he looked at her. A longer look this time, taking in the exhaustion she was carrying and trying not to show, the horse who was clearly done for the day, the state of her boots which she realized were still damp from the creek crossing. He pushed off the post and came down the porch steps. "Put the horse in the barn," he said. "There's a stall open at the far end, hay in the left corner. Water trough's not frozen yet." He reached the bottom step and held his hand out for the letter. She held it back. "He told me to make sure you read it before I leave," she said. I promised him. Gideon's hand stayed where it was for a moment. Then it dropped to his side. "Then come inside," he said. "You look like you haven't eaten since last week." The inside of the cabin was warm in the way that a well-built fire and a well-insulated structure combine to produce not the suffocating, smoky warmth of a bad fireplace, but something even and genuine, the kind of warmth that settled into cold bones slowly and felt almost painful when you'd been outside long enough. Eliza stood just inside the door for longer than was polite, unable to help it. The interior was spare. A table with 2 chairs, both solid and hand-built. A bunk against the eastern wall, military neat, with a wool blanket folded at the foot. A shelf of supplies, dried goods, canned goods, items arranged with the same organizational logic as the woodpile outside. A window on the south wall with good light, an iron stove in the center of the room that explained the warmth, with a pot on it that smelled like something with meat and root vegetables. No decoration, no personal items displayed, nothing on the walls except a single nail with a coat hanging from it. The absence of personal things was more striking to her than anything else. Most people, even people with very little, accumulated a few objects that announced who they were. A photograph, a piece of cloth with color. Something. Gideon's cabin said almost nothing about who Gideon was. "Sit," he said, nodding at the table. He moved to the stove and ladled something into a tin bowl from the pot. "Venison stew. It's 3 days old, but it's been simmering, so it's still good. You don't have to I know I don't." He set the bowl on the table in front of one of the chairs, then the letter beside it. Went to the shelf and retrieved a chunk of bread wrapped in cloth. "Put that down, too." "Eat, then I'll read it." She sat. The stew was, in fact, still good. Better than good, she thought, in the way that any food consumed after genuine hunger tends to be elevated. She ate slowly, trying not to seem ravenous, and watched him from the corner of her eye. He'd sat in the other chair with the letter in front of him but wasn't reading it. He was waiting, she realized, giving her time to eat before he opened it, because whatever was in that envelope, he'd clearly decided he didn't want to receive it while also managing a half-starved woman's immediate needs. That consideration struck her. She hadn't expected it from him. "I don't know what it says," she told him when she'd eaten enough to feel like herself again. "He didn't tell me." Gideon nodded slowly. His eyes were on the envelope. "Your father and I went back a long way," he said. "Before I came out here. Before a lot of things." He picked up the letter, looked at it for another moment, then broke the seal. Eliza looked at her stew and gave him the privacy of not watching his face while he read. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, and she could hear it moving through the pines in long, low sighs. The stove ticked. The fire shifted. She heard Gideon make a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh, and it wasn't quite the opposite. It was the sound a person makes when something lands on them that they weren't braced for. She looked up. He was still reading, or rereading, rather. His eyes were moving back over the page in the way that eyes do when the mind hasn't fully absorbed what they've already passed over. When he finished the second time, he set the letter down flat on the table and put both hands on top of it and looked at the stove. "I see," he said. "Mr. Mercer? Did you know," he said, not looking at her, "that your father once pulled me out of a situation that would have ended my life? Not metaphorically, literally. There was a gun involved and several men who had decided they were done with me existing." A pause. "Edmund Hartwell was the only person in that room who thought I was worth the trouble of saving. I've owed him a debt ever since." He looked at her then. "Apparently he's decided to collect it." She set her spoon down carefully. "What does the letter say?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was working through something she couldn't quite name. "It says," Gideon said slowly, "that you have nowhere to go, that your father's debts are significant, that you're too proud to ask for help and too smart to pretend you don't need it." He paused. "And that he would consider it a personal favor, his words, if I would look after you." The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt different. Eliza sat very still. "He doesn't mean—" "He means marriage," Gideon said flatly. "He's not subtle about it. Your father was many things, but subtle wasn't one of them." He stood up, carried his untouched cup of coffee to the stove, set it down. "He says you'd make a good rancher's wife, says you've got practical sense and you're not afraid of hard work. Says he's been watching the Mercer homestead from a distance for 2 years, and he thinks—" He stopped. A muscle in his jaw moved. "He thinks I'm going to lose this place inside of 18 months if I keep on alone." The silence stretched. "Is he right?" Eliza asked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked at her sharply. "About which part?" "About the ranch," she said. "Is it struggling?" Another pause, longer this time. "Yes," he said. It sounded like the word cost him something. Eliza looked at the table, looked at her hands, thought about the bank in Boise City, and the figure the man there had named with professional sympathy, the total of her father's debts, and the timeline he'd given her before that number became a claim against the land itself. Thought about what came after that and found, as she had each time she'd tried to think about it, that she couldn't see anything beyond the edge of it. "Then we have a problem in common," she said. He said no. Not cruelly and not immediately, but clearly. He said it in the way that a man says something he's thought through rather than something he's reacting to. Measured, certain, delivered without malice. "I'm not in the habit of making decisions that affect someone else's entire life in the space of an afternoon," Gideon said. "Your father's letter is," he seemed to search for the right word, "generous in its conclusions about what I need, but he's not here to make the argument in person." "I know," Eliza said, "and you've had 3 days on a horse in freezing weather. You're not thinking clearly." "I am, actually," she said. "I find that hardship tends to sharpen things for me rather than dull them." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking you to make a decision this afternoon. I'm asking for a chance to make an argument." Gideon looked at her. "You rode 3 days to give me a letter," he said. "Now you want to make an argument." "My father asked me to deliver the letter and make sure you read it. I've done that. The rest is—" She straightened in her chair. "The rest is my own idea." That surprised him. She could see it, the slight recalibration in his expression. "All right," he said. "Make the argument." She'd thought about this too during the ride. She'd thought about it so much that she'd almost worn it smooth, which she knew could be a danger. An argument rehearsed too many times started to sound rehearsed rather than true. "I don't want charity," she said. "I want to be clear about that from the start. If that's what you're offering, a place to stay out of obligation to my father, then I'll thank you for the stew and be on my way in the morning. I can figure something else out." She hoped this was true. She wasn't entirely certain it was. "What I want is a partnership." "A marriage isn't necessarily a partnership." "No," she agreed. "Most marriages aren't. But this one wouldn't be most marriages." She looked at him steadily. "I understand ranching. My father raised me to it from the time I could walk. I can manage accounts. I know livestock. I can manage a household, and I can keep books, and I can do a half-dozen things around a property that most men pay wages to get done. You need those things." A pause. "I need stability. I need a place where the bank can't reach me. In exchange for that place, I'll work alongside you for it. Not for you. Alongside you." Gideon was quiet. "And if it doesn't work," he said finally, "if we're two people who can't stand to be in the same room after 3 months, then we negotiate a different arrangement," Eliza said. "I'm not naive about what we are to each other. We're strangers. This isn't a story about romance. It's two people with a common problem deciding whether they trust each other enough to solve it together." He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "You sound very certain of what this is," he said. "I'm certain of what it isn't," she said. "The rest I'm willing to learn." The fire shifted in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. "There's a second room," Gideon said. "Small, storage mostly. It would need to be cleared out." Eliza's breath caught. She kept her face still. "That's manageable," she said. "I don't talk much in the mornings." "That's fine. I work long days. I won't apologize for expecting the same from anyone working this property." "I don't need apologies," she said. "I need honest expectations." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she began to wonder if she'd somehow pushed too hard, said something that had landed wrong without her knowing it. "Your father," Gideon said carefully. "When he was sick, was he alone at the end, or were you there?" The question surprised her. "I was there," she said. "Every day." He nodded slowly. Something in his face, briefly, barely, acknowledged something she didn't fully understand. Then it was gone. "There's a town 12 miles south," he said. "Harlan has a justice of the peace. If we're going to do this, we do it properly. Not because of what people think, but because property rights in this territory follow marriage law, and I want your stake in this place to be legal and documented." Eliza felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. "When?" she asked. "Give it a week," he said. "You get to know the property. I get to know whether what you say about your abilities is true or something you've talked yourself into believing. If at the end of a week you haven't changed your mind and I haven't changed mine, we ride into Harlan." It wasn't warmth. It wasn't the beginning of something that felt like a future. It was practical and conditional, and about as romantic as a land deed. But for the first time since she'd found her father's letter inside his Bible, Eliza Hartwell felt like the ground under her feet might be solid. "That's fair," she said. She slept that first night in the storage room on a blanket he'd folded onto the floor because there wasn't a bed, and woke before dawn to the sound of Gideon already moving in the main room. Careful, quiet movements, the deliberate sounds of a man who'd lived alone long enough to forget there was anyone to be quiet for, and then remembered. She found him at the stove, building the fire up from the night's banked coals. "The horse," she said. "I'll check on him." He glanced at her. "Already done." She felt the subtle implication of that. He'd been up earlier than she'd thought, had done a morning check before she'd woken, and decided not to take it as a comment on her. Maybe it wasn't one. "I'll do it tomorrow," she said. He nodded. The first day she took stock, not in a way that advertised itself, but quietly and thoroughly, as her father had taught her. Walk the property with your eyes open and your mouth shut, and let it tell you what it needs before you start making pronouncements about it. What it told her was that her father had not been wrong. The ranch had the bones of something solid, decent acreage, good water access from the creek that cut through the eastern pasture, a solid barn built by someone who'd understood structure, livestock that were lean but healthy. But the bones were showing. The fence along the north pasture had 3 significant gaps that had been temporarily patched rather than properly repaired. The hay storage was lower than it should have been this early in the season for the size of the cattle herd. The garden plot behind the cabin had been abandoned sometime in the summer. She could see the outlines of what had been planted and wasn't any longer. And the account ledger she found on the shelf, she'd asked permission and received a short nod, showed that money was going out in ways that were manageable only barely and only for now. She didn't say any of this immediately. She spent 2 days observing before she said anything. On the 3rd day, while they were both working on the north fence, she'd found the post digger in the barn and been at it before he'd finished his morning coffee, which earned her a look she chose to interpret as approval. She said, "The hay's going to be short." Gideon drove a post without looking at her. "I know. There's a way to extend it. Reduce the herd by 4 head going into winter, sell them now while there's still market, buy hay with the proceeds, and end up with more hay than you'd have otherwise, while also reducing the mouth count." She paused, waiting for him to tell her she was wrong. "I've run the numbers." A pause. He set the post and stood up straight, looked at the fence line. "Which 4?" he said. She named them. She had been watching the cattle, and gave her reasons for each one. He listened without interruption. "The red one with the bad eye," he said when she finished. "She's a good milker. She's also got a hip that's going to give her trouble come spring. You'll lose her then anyway and get less for her." Silence. The wind moved through the dead grass in the pasture. "All right," he said. That was how it went, the first week. Conversation sparse and functional. Work continuous. The evaluating silence between them that she didn't try to fill. She cooked because she was faster at it and kept the fire going, and did the morning livestock check on days when he had to ride out for other tasks, and mended 3 pieces of harness that had been waiting for attention on a peg in the barn. On the 6th day, he came back from checking the eastern fence to find her on the roof of the storage shed, resecuring a section of shingles that had been lifting in the wind. He stood below and looked up at her for a long moment. "You could have waited for me," he said. "It was going to rain tonight," she said without looking down. If it rained on an unsealed section, the wall beneath would have taken water damage. The repair cost for a wall is more than the repair cost for 3 shingles. Silence from below. "Hand me the pitch can," she said. He handed it up. On the 7th day he said, "We should ride into Harlan tomorrow." Eliza looked up from the account ledger. He was standing in the doorway of the cabin, coat on, just back from the barn. "You haven't changed your mind," she said. "No." He looked at her levelly. "Have you?" She thought about the week, the work, the silences that had been unexpectedly tolerable, the way he'd looked at the cattle she'd selected for sale and hadn't argued, and the way that not arguing had felt, not like agreement exactly, but like respect. The way she'd slept without the grinding anxiety that had chased her for 3 weeks, because for the first time there was something concrete and possible where there had only been impending loss. "No," she said. The town of Harlan had the particular quality of a place that had survived its first optimistic decade and settled into the pragmatism of not expecting more. Main Street was mud-frozen in the autumn chill, storefronts practical rather than aspirational, the church at the north end, the newest-looking building in town, and also the most used. They rode in side by side, which was its own statement. A man who almost never came to town, arriving with a woman no one recognized, heading toward the Justice of the Peace's office. Eliza felt the attention without seeing most of it. That was the thing about small towns. The watching happened in peripheral vision, through glass windows and around door frames, registered as a texture in the air rather than anything you could point to directly. Gideon seemed to feel it too. His face went a degree more closed than usual as they tied the horses at the hitching post outside Judge Albright's office. "They'll talk," she said quietly. "They already are," he said. The ceremony, such as it was, took less than 15 minutes. Judge Albright was a small, careful man who asked the necessary questions and witnessed their signatures and shook their hands and offered congratulations in the brisk tone of someone who understood that this particular couple was not in the market for sentimentality. When they walked back out into the cold morning air, Eliza Hartwell was Eliza Mercer. She tested the name in her head the way you tested ice before putting your full weight on it. It felt strange, real, like something that would take getting used to. Gideon was untying his horse. "There's a general store," he said. "I need to pick up a few things. We can get supplies while we're here." "All right." They were nearly to the store when a voice cut across the street. "Well, I'll be damned." The woman who'd spoken was coming out of the post office across the way, tall, dressed in clothing that was several degrees more expensive than anything Harlan generally wore, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of posture that announced, without subtlety, that she considered herself the most significant person in any room she entered. Matilda Crow. Eliza didn't know the name yet, but she recognized the type. She'd seen it in Boise City, the particular combination of genuine wealth and the willingness to use it as a blunt instrument. The woman crossed the street toward them with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew they could afford to move slowly because no one was going to start without them. "Gideon Mercer," she said, "twice in 1 year." Her eyes moved to Eliza with an assessment that was not unkind but was thorough and entirely unself-conscious. "And you are?" "Eliza," she said. "Mercer." A pause. The woman's eyes went to Gideon. Something moved across her face, brief, controlled, and entirely unreadable. "Is that so?" said Matilda Crow. "It is," Gideon said. His tone was flat, neutral, the way a door sounds when it closes without quite slamming. Matilda's smile was the kind that had been practiced until it contained almost no information. "How wonderful," she said. "I imagine we'll be seeing more of each other then." Her eyes came back to Eliza. "The frontier can be an unwelcoming place for newcomers, Mrs. Mercer. I do hope you find what you're looking for." The pleasantry carried some weight Eliza couldn't yet identify. "Good day to you both." She moved past them and continued up the street, unhurried, without looking back. Eliza watched her go. "Who is that?" she asked. Gideon was already turning back toward the store, his jaw set. "Someone with opinions about my water rights," he said. Eliza filed this away, quietly and carefully, in the part of her mind that noticed things that might matter later. They rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon, the loaded pack horse trailing behind them. The sky had gone the particular shade of pewter gray that meant snow by evening, and the wind had come up from the north with the cold, wet smell of it already in the air. Neither of them had spoken much since Harlan. Not the uncomfortable silence of two people who couldn't talk to each other. More the functional quiet of two people who were both thinking and found that, for now, thinking was sufficient. When the ranch came into view through the trees, Eliza felt something she hadn't expected. Not happiness, exactly. Not the warm thing that was supposed to accompany a wedding day, but something else. Something more durable than happiness and less easily shaken. The sight of that cabin with its solid walls and the smoke beginning to thin from the chimney where the fire had been banked low, the barn visible beyond, the property in all its struggling realness. It wasn't much, but it was something that could be made into something. As they were unloading the pack horse in the barn, Gideon said, without looking up from the supply crate he was carrying, "The second room needs a proper bed." Eliza kept working. "Yes." I'll build one. Give me a few days. There's no rush, she said. The floor is fine for now. Gideon set the crate down and looked at her across the barn. It's not fine, he said. It's just what we have. He picked the crate back up. There's a difference. She looked at his back as he carried the crate toward the storage shelf. Thought about that distinction. Not fine, just what we have, and found that it told her something about him she hadn't known before. The snow started around supper time, light and steady, coming down through the pine branches in the windless way that good heavy snowfalls usually began. Eliza stood at the cabin door for a few minutes before bed and watched it. Inside, she could hear Gideon banking the fire for the night, the same careful, practiced sounds as the night before. She thought about Matilda Crow's smile and the thing inside it she couldn't name. She thought about the ranch and what it needed, and what she and this difficult, careful man she'd married might be able to make of it. She thought about her father, who had known Gideon Mercer for years, and had chosen, in his final weeks, with everything in him going quiet, to use what remained of his voice to write one letter to one man. She thought she might be beginning to understand why. The snow kept falling. The fire inside was warm, and somewhere in the machinery of what came next, something had already begun to move. The snow that had started falling on the night they returned from Harlan didn't stop for 4 days. By the second morning, the drifts along the north fence had buried the bottom rail entirely, and the world beyond the tree line had gone white and featureless, the kind of erasure that made the frontier feel both vast and suffocating at the same time. Gideon spent those 4 days moving between the cabin and the barn in the methodical rhythm of a man who'd survived enough winters to stop being surprised by them, and Eliza spent them learning the specific geography of the homestead from the inside out, where things were kept, what order the morning tasks ran in, which animals needed extra watching, and which were solid enough to be left to their own competence. They developed a routine the way two people who don't talk much develop routines, not through discussion, but through the gradual negotiation of shared space. He took the early barn check. She had coffee on before he came back in. He split the day's wood after breakfast while she worked on whatever the indoor list held. Mending, accounts, food preservation, the 100 small maintenance tasks that a homestead generated constantly, and that had been, she suspected, going undone for some time before she arrived. They worked alongside each other in the afternoons on whatever needed 2 sets of hands, ate supper mostly in silence that was, she'd decided, not hostile. Just the silence of 2 people who were tired and who hadn't yet found the particular frequency on which they could talk easily. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was something in between that she didn't have a word for. On the 5th day, the snow stopped and the sky went that particular hard blue of a cleared winter sky, brilliant and cold, and Gideon came in at midday stamping snow off his boots and said, without preamble, "The south pasture fence needs work before the next storm. I could use another set of hands." "Give me 5 minutes," Eliza said. They worked for 3 hours in the cold, replacing 2 rotted posts and restringing wire along a section that had sagged badly under the snow's weight. The work required coordination without a lot of talking. One person holding tension on the wire while the other stapled, switching positions when one set of hands got too cold to grip properly. By the end of it, Eliza's fingers had gone from numb to a painful returning warmth, and she'd learned that Gideon worked with the kind of focused efficiency that made asking unnecessary questions feel genuinely rude. She respected that about him, she realized. The lack of performance in how he worked. No commentary on the difficulty of the task or the coldness of the day. Just the task itself, approached directly. He handed her a cup of coffee when they got back inside, and it occurred to her that this was something he'd done each time she came in from the cold. Not offered, just handed, already poured. She wasn't sure when she'd started expecting it. "The cattle sale," he said, sitting across from her at the table. "I rode into Harlan yesterday while you were working on the barn ledger, talked to Pearson at the stock office." A pause. "He offered a fair price, the 4 head you picked. It'll cover the hay purchase with enough left over to get us through February without touching the reserve." Eliza looked at him. "You didn't tell me you were going." "It was a practical matter. I handled it. It was also a decision that affects the ranch's finances," she said, keeping her voice even. "We should be making those together." The silence that followed had a different quality than the usual ones. Gideon looked at his coffee cup. "You're right," he said finally. The words sounded like they'd come from a place that didn't produce them easily. I'm not used to consulting anyone. I know you're not, she said. I'm telling you it needs to change, not criticizing that it was how things were before. He nodded, just once, but it was a real nod. Pearson asked about you, he said then. People talk. The marriage. Wanted to know who you were, where you'd come from. What did you tell him? That you were Edmund Hartwell's daughter, and that was enough for any reasonable person to know. He picked up his coffee. He agreed. Eliza felt something warm move through her chest at that. Her father's name used as a credential, offered plainly and without embellishment. She looked down at the table. Thank you, she said quietly. Gideon didn't answer, but he didn't dismiss it either, which she was beginning to understand was its own kind of acknowledgement from him. It was that same evening, while she was copying numbers into the account ledger, that she found the irregularity. She almost missed it. It was buried in a column of routine entries, supply costs, labor, livestock fees, and the amount itself was not dramatic. But the notation beside it was wrong. It referenced a water use fee paid to something called the Crow Land and Water Company, dated 8 months back, for an amount that struck her as significant given the size of the homestead's water access. She went back through the ledger, found 3 more, spread over 2 years, each one in the quiet middle of a column where it wouldn't draw attention. Gideon, she said. He was at the other end of the table, sharpening a knife with the steady, absent focus of a man doing something that didn't require thought. He looked up. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. What is the Crow Land and Water Company? His face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It went, briefly, completely still. Not the controlled stillness she'd already cataloged, but something more abrupt. Like a man who's just put his foot down and found empty air where he expected ground. Where did you see that? He said. It's in your own ledger, she said. 4 payments. I'm asking what they're for. He set the knife down slowly, leaned forward and looked at the entry she was pointing to. She watched his jaw tighten. Matilda Crow, he said, has been making a claim for 2 years that the main creek feeding this property falls partially under a water rights allocation that her late husband purchased in 1881. He sat back. She's been billing me for access to water that I've used freely since I built on this land. Her position is that she owns the rights to a portion of the watershed upstream. And you've been paying her. I've been paying her to avoid a legal dispute I couldn't afford to fight, he said. It's not the same thing as agreeing she's right. Eliza looked at the numbers again, added them in her head. The total was not nothing. Is she right? She said. About the water rights? I don't know, he said, and the honesty of that admission, the clear discomfort it cost him, told her it was actually true. The original land registration for this property is... He stopped, looked at the stove. It's complicated. The records from when the territory first opened this area for homesteading are not well organized. She has a document. I have a document. I don't know which one holds up. Where are your records? There's a box. He got up, went to the shelf, moved 3 items aside, and retrieved a flat wooden box she hadn't noticed before. Set it on the table. I haven't looked at most of it in years. I don't... A pause. I'm better at building things than reading legal documents. Eliza opened the box. Inside was a collection of papers in varying states of preservation. Some carefully folded, some loose, some showing water damage at the corners. She spread several of them on the table and bent over them. Give me tonight, she said. Gideon stood looking at the papers. At her. At the papers again. What do you know about water rights law? He said. Less than a lawyer, she said, without looking up. More than a rancher who's been paying fees he might not owe. She glanced at him. My father served on the land committee for 6 years. I went to half those meetings with him. I absorbed more than either of us realized at the time. He stood there for another moment. Then he went and sat in the chair by the stove, and she worked, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. The papers, once she'd organized them into something like chronological order, told a story that was incomplete but interesting. The original homestead registration for the Mercer property predated the Crow water rights claim by nearly 4 years. There was a survey document, faded but legible, that described the creek boundary with enough specificity to make an argument. And there was a letter from the Territorial Land Office dated 1879, that appeared to address the specific question of water access for this parcel. She couldn't read it all tonight, and she couldn't assess what she didn't know, but she was becoming increasingly certain that what Matilda Crowe had been collecting was something closer to extortion than a legitimate fee. She didn't say this to Gideon. Not yet. She needed to be sure. What she did say, when she finally looked up and found him still awake in the chair by the stove, was, "Don't pay her again." He looked at her. "The next billing comes, and I assume it comes in the spring?" "March," he said. "Don't pay it," she said. "Not until we understand what we're actually dealing with." She paused. "Can you do that without her taking action immediately?" "She'll send someone to ask," he said slowly. "She'll push before she goes to anything legal. Then we have until spring to figure this out." She started carefully refolding the papers. "I want to talk to someone in the land office. In Boise City, not Harlan. Someone who has access to the original territorial survey records." Gideon watched her put the papers back in the box. "You've been here 11 days, he said. "Yes." "And you're already restructuring my finances and challenging a woman who has more legal resources than most people in this territory." She met his eyes. "You told me you were losing this place in 18 months. That hasn't changed. What's changed is that you're not doing it alone anymore." She closed the box. "I told you, alongside, not for you." The silence that followed was different from the other silences. It had weight and texture and something in it that she couldn't name, but that felt, cautiously and without any certainty, like the beginning of trust. "There's a man in Boise City," Gideon said after a moment. "Name of Aldridge. He's handled land disputes before. I've heard his name spoken well." He paused. "I'll ride down in 2 weeks, when the pass is clear enough." "We'll ride down," Eliza said. He looked at her. "We'll ride down," he said. The weeks that followed had a quality she hadn't expected. Not easy, but productive in a way that felt like momentum. Real, concrete momentum, the kind you could measure in fence posts and hay bales and account columns that no longer showed a one-way flow. Gideon was not a man who changed easily, and she was not a woman who pretended things were simpler than they were, and so their daily life together remained functional and careful and somewhat formal in ways that would probably have looked strange to outsiders. But there was a steadiness to it that she found, incrementally and with some surprise, that she valued. He finished building the bed for the second room on a Sunday, working most of the day while she was doing other tasks, and when he knocked on the doorframe that evening and said simply, "It's done," she went and looked and found a solid, plain-framed bed with careful joinery and a rope-strung base, built by someone who'd made sure the thing would last rather than made sure it would impress. "It's good work," she said. "It's a bed," he said, which was, she'd come to understand, the closest he typically came to accepting a compliment. She met some of the neighbors gradually, in the way that winter on the frontier limited, not through visiting, which the weather discouraged, but through the occasional necessary intersection at the trading post or at Harlan's general store. Most of them were polite, curious in the way people were when they'd heard a story about someone and then encountered the actual person. A few of the women were warmer than that, genuinely interested, asking questions about where she'd come from, how she found the frontier, whether she was managing. She gave careful answers. She was polite and present and gave nothing away that she didn't choose to give. The name that came up more than once in these conversations was Matilda Crowe's, always with a certain quality of careful language, the kind people used around a subject that had edges. Mrs. Crowe has been generous to this community, of course. Mrs. Crowe has considerable interests in the valley. I'm sure you'll find her quite reasonable if you stay on her good side. The last was from a woman named Ruth Pearson, the stock agent's wife, delivered with a look that communicated something her words were carefully not saying. Eliza heard it, filed it away beside everything else she was accumulating about Matilda Crowe. Then there was the matter of Cole Briggs. She'd noticed him the first time in Harlan, about 3 weeks after the wedding. A stocky man with a watchful face who'd been standing outside the general store when she and Gideon tied their horses, and who'd found reasons to be near them twice more during the short time they'd been in town without ever being obviously near them. The second time she'd spotted him had been on the road, a distance back, visible for about a quarter mile before a bend in the road put him behind a tree line and he didn't reappear. She mentioned it to Gideon on the ride home. His jaw tightened, which by now she'd learned to read. "You know who he is?" she said. He works for Matilda Crow, Gideon said. Has for about 3 years. She keeps him around for general purposes. The way he said general purposes communicated clearly that the purposes were not entirely general. He's watching us, she said. He's watching me, Gideon said. He has been, off and on, since I stopped negotiating on the water rights 6 months ago. He paused. Before you arrived, I stopped paying attention to it. Why? Because I didn't have a way to do anything about it, he said. The admission sat flatly between them. And because there wasn't, he stopped. Because it didn't matter to you, she said quietly. Not as an accusation, just as an observation. He didn't answer, but his hands tightened briefly on the reins. She thought about what that meant. A man who'd been living under low-level surveillance and had stopped caring enough to be bothered by it, because the thing being threatened wasn't quite real enough to him to fight for. Something about that pressed on her in a way she didn't expect. It matters now, she said. The ranch. Whatever she's planning. It matters now. The road ran between ice-edged banks, the horse's breath coming out in white clouds. Yes, Gideon said, it does. They didn't speak again until they reached the property line where the split-rail entrance gate stood, which Gideon had recently rehung so it actually closed properly. He dismounted to open it, and when she rode through, she noticed him look back down the road behind them before he followed. No Cole Briggs visible, but they both knew that didn't mean anything. The trip to Boise City happened in early December, in a window of clear weather that felt borrowed. The kind of clear that the sky offered briefly and then took back. They rode down together and stayed 2 nights at a boarding house near the center of town, which cost more than Eliza would have liked, but less than 2 separate accommodations, a practicality neither of them needed to discuss. The man named Aldridge turned out to be a small, precise attorney who operated out of a tidy office above a dry goods store, and who, once he'd examined the documents Eliza had organized and copied from Gideon's box, sat back in his chair and was quiet for long enough that she counted 14 seconds before he spoke. "This is interesting," he said. "Interesting good or interesting bad?" Gideon said. "Interesting in the sense that Mrs. Crow's claim has a genuine legal foundation," Aldridge said carefully. "Her husband did purchase water rights in this watershed in 1881. That is a matter of territorial record." He held up one finger. "However," he turned one of the papers, the letter from the land office, toward them. "This document, which appears to be a clarification issued by the Territorial Land Office in response to a dispute, establishes a clear hierarchy for water access on this parcel. The homestead right predates the Crow purchase. Under territorial law as it currently stands, the homestead water right is senior." Gideon stared at him. "She knows this?" "I think it's reasonable to conclude," Aldridge said, with the careful phrasing of a man who'd spent years choosing words that couldn't be used against him, that anyone with access to competent legal counsel would know this. "Then she's been collecting money she has no right to collect," Eliza said. "I would say she's been taking advantage of the fact that the documentation establishing the senior right was not easily locatable or interpreted without legal training," Aldridge said, "which is a slightly more defensible position, slightly." He looked at them both. "What I can tell you is that if you stop paying and she brings a legal action, the territorial court would very likely rule in your favor, particularly with this letter properly authenticated. And if she tries something outside of court," Gideon said. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. "Then you would have a different kind of problem," he said, "and you'd need to document any actions taken against you very carefully." He paused. "Mrs. Crow has considerable resources and considerable motivation to protect her position. She has been building something in this valley for 15 years. A legal defeat on water rights creates a precedent that could unravel several of her other holdings." He let that land. Eliza looked at Gideon. Gideon was looking at the documents on Aldridge's desk, and she could see him absorbing the weight of what the attorney had just said. Not the legal dimension of it, which was actually the better news than either of them had expected, but the thing beneath it. The thing that said, "This woman has more to lose than you realized, and that makes her more dangerous than you'd planned for." "Proceed," Gideon said. Aldridge looked up. "I'm sorry?" "File whatever you need to file to begin establishing our claim formally," Gideon said. "Don't send Crow anything yet, but get it documented." Aldridge nodded, making notes. "That's prudent. It gives you a legal record with a timestamp predating any action she might take. He looked at Eliza. You identified this issue, Mrs. Mercer? I was reviewing the accounts, she said. Aldridge regarded her for a moment with the particular look of someone reassessing their initial estimate of a person. Thorough bookkeeping, he said, has saved more properties than any rifle in this territory. I mean that genuinely. They rode back to their ranch in the gathering dusk of the second day, the horses moving easily on the frozen road, the land around them gone silver and blue in the early winter light. The conversation they'd had in Aldridge's office had shifted something between them. Not dramatically, not in any way she could point to specifically, but she felt it the same way she felt the change in air pressure before weather came in. They were not just two people managing a struggling homestead anymore. They were two people who had, without quite deciding to, stepped into something with larger stakes than either had originally named. She's going to find out, Eliza said. When we stop paying in March, she'll know. Yes. And Cole Briggs will still be watching. Yes. We need to be careful about what they can see, she said. About what's in the barn, the hay storage, the livestock. If she decides to apply pressure another way, she won't come at us directly, Gideon said. Not at first. She'll use other people, rumors maybe, questions about the marriage, the legality, the property claim. He paused. There are people in that valley who owe her favors. She'll use them before she uses Cole Briggs. Eliza considered this. The cold was sharp in her nose, the horses breathing steadily, the tree line dark on either side. Then we make sure the people who matter know us well enough not to believe what she says, she said. Gideon glanced at her. I'm not a social man, he said. It was a statement of fact rather than an apology. I know, she said, but I am. She met his eyes briefly. Let me work with that. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. The ranch appeared through the trees, the cabin dark since they'd been gone 2 days, the barn hulking in the dusk. It looked cold and slightly abandoned from this distance, and Eliza had the sudden sharp impulse to get the lights on and the fire going and the horses seen to make it look like what it was becoming. A place that was lived in, tended, worth defending. She dismounted before they reached the hitching post and took both horses by the reins while Gideon unlocked the cabin, and by the time he had the lamp lit in the window, she'd already started toward the barn, moving through the cold with purpose, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. Behind her, the light in the window grew. The strategy Eliza had outlined on the ride back from Boise City. Make sure the people who matter know us well enough not to believe what she says. Turned out to be easier to name than to execute. The problem wasn't Gideon's reluctance, exactly. It was more that his years of deliberate isolation had created a kind of social debt that couldn't be paid back quickly, and the frontier had a long memory for the ways a person had chosen to present themselves. He'd chosen, for a long time, to present himself as someone who didn't need anything from anyone. People had accommodated that choice and organized their expectations around it, and now those expectations sat between them and the neighbors like a fence that didn't have a gate. Eliza started small. She brought a jar of preserved plums to Ruth Pearson at the stock office when she and Gideon went to Harlan in mid-December, a small gesture that cost her nothing but 15 minutes of her morning and a jar she could spare. Ruth was visibly surprised, not at the plums themselves, but at the fact of Eliza stopping, making the gesture, staying to talk for 10 minutes about the coming weather and the condition of the roads and whether Ruth's youngest had recovered from the cough that had been going around. By the time they left, something had shifted in the way Ruth looked at Gideon. Not dramatically, but the slight wariness she'd had in her eyes before, the careful neutrality of a woman who didn't know what to make of a man's new wife, had loosened a little. It was small, but Eliza understood that social trust, like water, moved in small amounts and accumulated over time. She did the same with the Dunmore family 3 properties east, brought extra bread she'd baked on a Friday when the oven was already hot, left it with Henry Dunmore when she passed his gate on an errand, stayed exactly long enough to be neighborly and not long enough to impose. Henry Dunmore was a quiet, careful man who reminded her slightly of Gideon, which meant he noticed things without saying much about them. The way he nodded at her when she left told her the bread had registered as something beyond bread. Gideon watched all of this without commenting for about 3 weeks. Then one evening he said, while she was writing a letter at the table, The Abbotts have a fence down on their north line. I've been meaning to offer help. Eliza kept writing. When were you going to do that? Probably never, he said honestly. She looked up. I could ride over tomorrow, he said, if you wanted to come. I do, she said. The Abbotts, Tom and Margaret, with 3 children in various stages of childhood, received them with the particular warmth of people who'd heard a confusing story about Gideon Mercer, and were now being given a chance to form a different one. Tom Abbott was the kind of man who expressed his feelings through practical action rather than words, and the fact that Gideon showed up with tools and spent 4 hours on the man's fence communicated more than a conversation probably would have. Margaret Abbott put coffee and food on the table and talked to Eliza with the relief of a woman who'd been starved for adult female company, and by the time they left in the afternoon, something had been established that had not existed before. It wasn't a social triumph. It was just 2 people becoming slightly more real to a community that had, until now, only had their absence to go on. But Matilda Crow's campaign was also underway by December, even if Eliza couldn't see its edges clearly yet. She became aware of it gradually, through the slight change in the quality of the silences when she walked into the general store, through something Ruth Pearson started to say one morning and then stopped, through the expression on a man's face at the post office when he looked from her to Gideon and back with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite suspicion, but sat in the uncomfortable territory between them. The specific shape of it emerged on a Tuesday, 2 days before Christmas, when she was in Harlan alone. Gideon was repairing the barn roof and she'd come for supplies, and a woman named Clara Jenks stopped her on the street with the poorly concealed excitement of someone delivering news they expected would be damaging. I heard something, Clara Jenks said. She was a narrow woman with sharp eyes and the social metabolism of someone who ran on other people's business. About the Mercer property. About the marriage. Eliza looked at her steadily. Is that so? There's talk. Clara's voice dropped to the register people used when they wanted to appear reluctant to gossip while actually savoring it. That the paperwork wasn't filed properly. That Judge Albright made an error in the registration. Something about a witness requirement that wasn't met. She paused for effect. That the marriage might not be legal. Eliza held the woman's gaze without blinking. That's interesting, she said, because I have the registration document in a box at the ranch, along with the judge's seal and 2 witness signatures. Would you like me to bring it next time I'm in town? Clara Jenks' expression wavered. I'm just saying what I heard, she said. I appreciate you telling me, Eliza said, in a tone that communicated the opposite. I'll make sure Judge Albright knows his work is being questioned. I'm sure he'll want to address it. She bought her supplies and rode home and said nothing to Gideon until after supper, when she told him calmly and in detail what Clara Jenks had said. His reaction was not what she expected. He didn't get angry. He got quiet in the specific way she'd come to understand meant he was placing information into a larger pattern he was assembling. It's a test, he said. For what? To see how we respond. If we panic, if we start making statements or going to Albright or making a fuss, it tells her we're rattled. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She's not trying to actually challenge the marriage. That would go nowhere, and she knows it. She's trying to see what we do when we're threatened. Eliza thought about this. Then we don't fuss, she said. We don't fuss, he agreed. We let it die on its own. And if it doesn't die on its own, then we deal with it when it's something real instead of something whispered on a street corner. He looked at her. You handled it right with the Jenks woman. Direct, but not defensive. She hadn't expected him to say that. The acknowledgement landed with a small, unexpected warmth. I almost said something less polite, she admitted. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the same territory. So did I, and I wasn't even there. January came down hard. The second week brought a storm that lasted 3 days and dropped enough snow to make the barn doors difficult to open, and the temperature in the nights went to the kind of cold that made metal hurt to touch. The livestock required constant attention, extra feed, ice broken from the water troughs twice daily. The chickens moved to a corner of the barn where the body heat of the cattle kept things just survivable. Eliza and Gideon moved through those days in the stripped-down state that serious winter produced. Functional, alert, no energy available for anything that wasn't necessary. On the second night of the storm, the lantern in the barn went out while she was in there doing the evening check, and she stood in the sudden darkness and the smell of hay and animal warmth and couldn't find the matches she was certain she'd put in her coat pocket. And she had one moment, just one. She was not a woman who allowed herself many, of something close to despair. Not about the lantern, about the accumulated weight of it, the cold and the work and the uncertainty and the constant low-level alertness of knowing Matilda Crow's machinery was running somewhere she couldn't see it. She found the matches in her other pocket, got the lantern lit, finished the check, came back inside. Gideon was at the stove when she came in, and he looked at her face with those careful dark eyes and didn't ask what was wrong, which was, she was coming to understand, one of the more useful things about him. He just poured hot water into a cup, added the dried herbs she'd taken to keeping on the shelf, and set it on the table. She sat down and put her hands around the cup and let the warmth come back into her fingers. "I found the matches," she said. "Good," he said. That was all. But he stayed at the table instead of going back to whatever he'd been doing, and she found that his presence in the silence was not a pressure but something more like ballast, and she was grateful for it in a way she wasn't quite ready to examine directly. It was in February that things began to move faster. The first sign was Cole Briggs appearing on the road with more frequency, not hiding anymore, which was, paradoxically, more unsettling than the careful distance he'd kept before. He was visible at the property line twice in 1 week, sitting his horse in the tree line on the far side of the road, not doing anything in particular, just being there, being seen. "He wants us to know he's watching," Gideon said, the second time Eliza pointed it out. "Why? What changes for him if we know?" "Nothing for him. For us, it's supposed to put pressure on the decision about March." Gideon's voice was flat. "She's reminding us that the payment is coming due." "We're not paying it," Eliza said. "I know." He looked down the road toward where Briggs had been. "I know." The second sign was less visible but more consequential. Tom Abbott came by on a Thursday morning, ostensibly to return a tool he'd borrowed, but he stayed on his horse when he handed it over, which meant he wasn't planning to come in, which meant the visit was something he wanted to complete quickly. "I heard something in town," Tom said. He was looking at his horse's ears rather than at Gideon. "About the spring grazing allotment. The Territorial Committee is reviewing the allocation for the Valley parcels." A pause. "Someone's put in a formal objection to the Mercer parcels claim. Says the original registration had an error in the acreage." Gideon was still for a moment. "Who filed the objection?" Tom Abbott's expression said he didn't need to ask and didn't want to answer. "When does the committee meet?" Gideon said. "March 15th, Tom said. "In Harlan." He finally looked at Gideon. "I thought you should know before the notice arrives. The official notice takes a while to travel." He handed down the tool, touched the brim of his hat at Eliza, and turned his horse around. They watched him ride out. "She's not using the water rights claim anymore," Eliza said slowly. "She's opening a second front. She's opening as many fronts as she can," Gideon said. His voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard before, not anger exactly, something harder and more settled than anger. "Spread it thin enough and something breaks." "Unless we're not thin," Eliza said. She was thinking, turning the pieces over. "Aldridge. Can he appear before the committee?" "At a cost." "What cost?" He named a number. She ran it against what she knew of their account and found it was possible, barely, without touching the reserve. "Write him," she said. "Today." Gideon looked at her. "Today," she said again. He went inside and wrote the letter. The committee notice arrived, as Tom Abbott had predicted, 4 days after his visit. A formal document with the territorial seal, cold and procedural in its language, announcing the review and requiring the Mercer property to submit documentation of its registration claims no later than February 28th. Eliza read it twice, folded it, and added it to the box with Aldridge's correspondence. They were managing. She told herself that clearly and without sentiment because she'd found that the frontier punished people who mistook management for safety. They were managing, which meant they were still standing, which meant there was still something to fight for. What she couldn't have predicted was the fire. It came on a Friday night in the second week of February, and it came fast, the way barn fires always came. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, and already too large by the time anyone knew it was happening. Eliza woke to the smell before anything else. Smoke, dense and specific, carrying the particular character of burning hay rather than burning wood. She was off the bed and at the window in seconds, and what she saw made her stomach drop completely out of her body. The hay barn, the secondary structure behind the main barn, was lit from inside, orange light visible through the gaps in the siding, smoke pouring from the roofline in the moonlit dark. "Gideon!" She was already moving, coat pulled on over her nightclothes, boots shoved onto bare feet. "Gideon, the barn!" He was awake before she reached the doorway of his room. She heard him moving, and then they were both running, out into the cold night air that now tasted of smoke, across the yard toward the orange glow. The hay barn held their entire winter stock. Everything they'd calculated and purchased and stacked with the specific arithmetic of making it through to spring. The main barn door was already open. Gideon had wrenched it wide while she was still crossing the yard, and inside the horses were moving with the tight, panicked energy of animals who could smell what was happening. She went in and got them out first, one and then the other, her hands shaking not from the cold, but from the specific combination of fear and adrenaline that made everything feel both too fast and too slow simultaneously. The horses went willingly, which they sometimes didn't in fire situations, and she got them to the fence post on the far side of the yard and tied them and then turned back. Gideon was at the hay barn. She could see him in the firelight, his figure dark against the glow, and what he was doing was not trying to go in. The interior was already beyond that, the smoke too thick and the fire too established. But standing at the side wall, throwing snow against the siding with the feed shovel in a controlled, methodical way that made no sense to her, until she understood he was trying to keep the fire from jumping to the main barn. The gap between the two structures was maybe 20 feet. She found the second shovel hanging on the fence post and went to work beside him without being asked. The snow was dry and light. February cold had taken the moisture out of it, but there was plenty of it, and they worked in the eerie quiet of people focused on something that mattered too much for talking, the fire roaring on the other side of the wall, the smoke rolling up into the night sky in a column visible for miles. They worked for 2 hours. The hay barn was a total loss before the first hour was done. They both knew it, and neither said it. But the main barn held. When the hay barn had burned down to its foundation and the fire had consumed what it was going to consume, the main barn was standing, damaged on the siding closest to the fire, scorched in places, but standing. They stood in the yard in the bitter cold, both of them coated in soot and smelling of smoke, looking at what remained. The cattle had gotten out at some point. She wasn't certain when, the fence must have given, and were standing in a loose group near the tree line, confused but unhurt. The horses were where she'd tied them. Gideon's face in the gray pre-dawn light was unreadable. He was looking at the smoldering ruin of the hay barn with the kind of stillness that was not calm. "That's the winter hay," he said. "I know." A silence. "We don't have—" "I know," she said. "Let me think." She was already doing the arithmetic, which was brutal and simple. Without the hay store, they had feed for the cattle for perhaps 3 weeks at current consumption. 3 weeks was not spring. They'd reduced the herd in November, which gave them some room, but not enough room. Not nearly enough. "Selling more cattle," she said. "The ones we were planning to hold for spring. The price won't be good. Buyers know a desperate seller. But it reduces the feed requirement while giving us cash to buy hay if there's any available." She turned to look at him. "Is there hay available? Does anyone in this valley have surplus they'd sell?" Gideon thought about it. "Dunmore, maybe. He overstocked his hay mow in October. I'll ride over this morning. Eliza—" "What?" He was looking at the barn foundation. A muscle worked in his jaw. This wasn't an accident. The words sat in the cold air between them. She'd been thinking it since the moment she'd smelled smoke, and she'd been not saying it because she needed to be certain, and because certainty about that particular thing had implications she wasn't ready to speak until she'd confirmed them. "What makes you say so?" she said carefully. "The hay barn doesn't have a lantern," he said. "I don't allow flame in there because of the fire risk. The main barn has the lantern, not the hay storage." He turned to look at her. There was no source for this fire. No lantern, no stove, no lightning in a clear sky. The temperature's been below freezing for 10 days. Spontaneous combustion doesn't happen in wet hay in February. She looked at the ruin. "Cole Briggs," she said. Gideon's jaw tightened.
I don't have proof.
No, she said, but we need to get some. The morning was cold and honest and full of the kind of work that came after a disaster. Horses to stable, cattle to round up, damage to assess in the flat accounting way that left no room for emotion because emotion wasn't useful. Henry Dunmore arrived before she'd even ridden out, drawn by the smoke column he'd seen from his own property, and he came with his son and an extra pair of hands and, more immediately useful than anything, the information that yes, he had surplus hay, and no, she didn't have to ride over. She could come by whenever and they'd work out terms. Henry stood looking at the foundation while his son and Gideon worked on the cattle. That started fast, Henry said quietly to Eliza. Yes, she said. Hay fires can, he said. Then, after a pause that had something deliberate in it, usually from the inside, she looked at him. He was still looking at the foundation, his face neutral. I appreciate you coming, she said. Neighbors, he said simply, and went to help with the cattle. It was Ruth Pearson who came the next day, with her husband, both of them carrying enough food to last the Mercers a week, a gesture so straightforwardly generous that Eliza had to work at keeping her expression steady when she answered the door. We heard, Ruth said. Jim and I wanted... She stopped. Started again. We know what a hay barn means in February. It means we're still figuring it out, Eliza said. Come in. They stayed 2 hours. Jim Pearson and Gideon talked through options at the table in the low, practical way men talked about problems they were trying to solve without revealing how worried they actually were. And Ruth sat across from Eliza and said, at a point when the conversation between the men had moved elsewhere, Clara Jenks has been saying things. Eliza looked at her. I know she came to you in December, Ruth said, with that nonsense about the marriage paperwork. She paused. It's not just her. There's been a pattern of it. Questions about your finances, about whether Gideon can hold the property. She met Eliza's eyes. It's coming from somewhere, and it's not coming from Clara Jenks on her own. That woman barely originates ideas. I know, Eliza said. What are you going to do about it? Eliza looked at the table, at the food Ruth and Jim had brought, stacked on the shelf. Real, practical, generous. The kind of thing that didn't happen between people who didn't actually mean it. I'm going to find out what she knows and how to prove it, she said. Ruth Pearson was quiet for a moment. My husband has access to the stock records, she said carefully, for the whole valley. Who bought? Who sold? When? At what price? She paused. If someone needed to move livestock quickly, at unusual times, before or after an event, that would show up in the records, Eliza said slowly. It would, Ruth said, if someone thought to look. The two women regarded each other. I'd be grateful, Eliza said, for Jim's opinion on the records, professionally speaking. I'll mention it to him, Ruth said. After they'd gone, Eliza stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at the burned foundation in the late afternoon light. The snow around it was gray with ash, and the smell still lingered in the cold air, and the absence of the barn was a physical presence in the yard, a hole in the space where something solid had been. Gideon came to stand beside her. Dunmore will sell us enough hay to get through, he said. It'll be tight, but it's survivable. Good, she said. A pause. Ruth Pearson told me something, she said. She turned it over once more before she said it, making sure she had it right. If Cole Briggs bought or sold livestock in the days before or after the fire, especially if he moved animals through the valley at an unusual time, that would be in the stock records. Gideon was very still beside her. Why would he do that? He said slowly. But because someone who does what he did that night doesn't always have somewhere to be afterward, she said. And a man on Matilda Crow's payroll who suddenly has reason to be away from his usual routine might use the cover of legitimate business. Livestock sale or purchase. Something that explains his presence in a particular area at a particular time. She looked at him. It's a guess. But it's a reasonable guess. He was looking at the foundation. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working through something large. Jim Pearson has the records, Eliza said. Yes, Gideon said, quietly. He does. The wind had come up from the north again, carrying the smell of new snow somewhere above them in the mountains. It would come down eventually. Everything up there came down eventually. But for the first time since she'd smelled smoke in the middle of the night and run barefoot across a frozen yard toward a burning barn, Eliza felt something that wasn't the cold desperation of pure reaction. She felt like they were beginning to move forward, like the thing they were doing now was not just surviving what Matilda Crowe had done to them, but starting, carefully and without announcing it, to find the edges of what she'd done, and why, and how to prove it. She didn't say any of this to Gideon. She just went back inside, put the kettle on, and got back to work. Jim Pearson brought the stock records on a Wednesday morning, without announcement, arriving at the ranch with the leather-bound ledger tucked under his arm and the expression of a man who had already decided something and wasn't going to be talked out of it. Gideon let him in. Eliza put coffee on. None of them discussed what they were doing in the careful, obvious way that people didn't discuss things they understood without needing to name. Jim set the ledger on the table and opened it to a page he'd already marked with a folded piece of paper. Cole Briggs sold 4 head on February 9th, he said. Private sale, registered through my office because the territorial rules require it. He tapped the entry. February 9th was a Thursday. Eliza looked at Gideon. The fire had been Friday night into Saturday morning. February 10th. Where was the sale? Gideon said. Registered as occurring at the Briggs property, Jim said, which is 12 miles north of here. He paused. But the buyer, a man named Orton, comes through the valley every few months buying small lots. Orton told me when I asked him casual-like that he'd actually picked those animals up on the road, not at any property. Briggs brought them to him on the Harlan Road late afternoon. He looked at them both, which puts Briggs on the Harlan Road, the road that runs past your south fence line, on the afternoon of the day before your barn burned. The kitchen was very quiet. That's not proof, Gideon said. No, Jim agreed. It's not. He closed the ledger. But a man selling cattle he doesn't need to sell at a price below what he'd get if he waited for market day in an unusual location the day before a suspicious fire. He shrugged. It's the kind of thing that looks different once you start looking. Eliza had been thinking since the night of the fire, running the problem the way her father had taught her to run difficult problems. Not trying to solve the whole thing at once, but pulling at the individual threads and seeing which ones had give. The stock records thread had give. But she'd been turning over another one alongside it, something that had nagged at her since her conversation with Aldridge in Boise City. Aldridge had said it almost offhandedly. A legal defeat on water rights creates a precedent that could unravel several of her other holdings. Several, not one. Not just the Mercer water claim. Mr. Pearson, she said, in your stock records, over the past 2 or 3 years, are there other properties in this valley that have been sold under circumstances that seemed unusual? Properties that were struggling, that had disputes with the Crowe holdings, that sold for less than they should have? Jim Pearson looked at her for a long moment. There are 2, he said. Maybe 3, depending on how you define unusual. I'd like to know about them, she said, if you're willing. He was quiet, turning his coffee cup. A man working through the specific calculation of how far he was willing to go. And Eliza didn't rush him because she understood that what she was asking wasn't small. She was asking him to help build a case against the most powerful landowner in the valley, and that had consequences that extended well beyond this kitchen table. The Halloran place, Jim said finally, sold 18 months ago. Frank Halloran had a water dispute with the Crowe holdings going back 4 years. He sold for about 60 cents on the dollar and moved his family to Oregon. He paused. Before he left, he told me, this was just conversation, nothing official, that he'd had 2 incidents, a fence cut and a storage shed fire. He met her eyes. He couldn't prove anything. Eliza felt something move through her. Not triumph, it was too early and too fragile for that, but the specific sensation of a thing that had been shapeless beginning to acquire edges. Frank Halloran's still in Oregon? Gideon said. Far as I know, Jim said. Got a brother in Portland. Could you get word to him? Eliza said. Nothing formal, just asking if he'd be willing to speak to someone. Jim Pearson picked up his ledger and stood. He tucked it under his arm and looked at them both with the expression of a man who'd come in having already made his decision and was confirming it was the right one. I'll write him this week, he said. After he left, Eliza and Gideon sat at the table in the kind of silence that followed when something important had just happened and neither person wanted to talk around it. If Halloran talks, Gideon said slowly, and if his incidents match ours in pattern, then it's not two isolated incidents, Eliza said. It's a method. She looked at the table. She's been doing this for years, using Briggs to apply pressure until people break and sell. The water rights dispute is just how she identifies targets, properties with senior water rights that she wants, that she can manufacture a claim against to create enough legal uncertainty to frighten people. Gideon was quiet for a moment. She picked the wrong property this time, he said. His voice when he said it was flat and certain, without performance, and it landed in her chest with a weight she didn't entirely expect. She did, Eliza said. The Territorial Land Committee meeting was on March 15th, and the March payment to the Crow Land and Water Company did not arrive from the Mercer property. Cole Briggs appeared at their fence line on March 3rd, and then again on March 7th, and on the second occasion, Gideon walked out to the fence line and stood at it without speaking and looked at Briggs across the distance until Briggs turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Eliza watched this from the porch. "What did you do?" she asked when he came back. "Nothing," he said. "I just let him see that I wasn't afraid of him looking." Was that true? He thought about it for a second, which she'd come to appreciate about him. The fact that he actually considered questions rather than just answering them. "Mostly," he said. Aldridge arrived in Harlan 3 days before the committee meeting, having ridden up from Boise City with the authenticated copies of the land office letter and the original survey document, along with a written brief he'd prepared for the committee that laid out the Mercer property's water rights claim with the careful, dense language of a man who'd built an argument he was confident in. They met with him the evening before the meeting, in the small office he'd rented for the week above the hardware store. "Crow's attorney will be there," Aldridge told them. "Man named Fitch. He's competent. He'll argue that the 1879 letter is ambiguous and that the senior right was never formally established under the revised territorial code of 1883. He set the papers down on the desk. He's not wrong that the letter is ambiguous. He is wrong about the 1883 code, and I have the relevant sections marked. He looked at Gideon. They may try to rattle you in the room. Questions about your registration, about the marriage, about the financial condition of the property. Don't answer anything I haven't told you to answer. I'm not good at that, Gideon said flatly. I know, Aldridge said. He glanced at Eliza. You? Better, she said. Then let her speak first when there's a question that isn't directly legal, Aldridge said, which was the most direct acknowledgement either of them had received from a professional man in this territory. And Eliza noted it quietly. The night before the meeting, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the bed Gideon had built and listened to the sound of the wind and ran through the argument in her head. Not the legal argument, Aldridge had that, but the larger one. The shape of what Matilda Crow had been doing and what proving it would require, and what happened if the committee ruled against them anyway. Because committees could be influenced, and Crow had been building influence in this valley for 15 years, and that didn't disappear because someone had good paperwork. She heard Gideon moving in the main room, the soft sounds of a man also not sleeping. She got up, put her coat on over her nightclothes, opened the door. He was sitting at the table in the dark, not with a lamp, just sitting. She could see his outline by the light that came through the window from the snow outside. Can't sleep either, she said. No. She sat down across from him. For a while, neither of them said anything, which was familiar by now and not uncomfortable. If it goes wrong tomorrow, Gideon said, not finishing the sentence. It won't go wrong, she said. But if it does, we have Halloran's letter, and we have Jim's records, and we have time to build a larger case. She paused. It won't be fast and it won't be clean, but it doesn't end tomorrow either way. He was quiet. I know, he said. I know that. He was looking at the window. I've had this land for 9 years. 9 years of... He stopped. Started differently. The first 3 years I could barely keep the livestock fed. There were 2 winters where I wasn't sure I was going to make it to spring. He said it without drama, as a plain fact. I kept thinking, one more year and it stabilizes. A pause. It never fully stabilized. But I stayed. Why? She said. He thought about it. Because leaving felt like admitting that I was someone who left, he said, and I'd already left enough things. She looked at his profile in the dim light, thought about a man who'd spent 9 years fighting for a piece of land, not entirely because of the land itself, but because of what giving up on it would have confirmed about him. "You're not alone in that fight anymore," she said. He turned and looked at her. His expression in the low light was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen it before, and she held his gaze without looking away. "No," he said, "I'm not." The morning of March 15th came in gray and cold, a thin snow falling that wasn't enough to make travel difficult, but was enough to make everything look serious. They rode into Harlan together, which by now had its own established language in the valley. People had started to read the two of them arriving somewhere together as a statement, though she doubted either of them had intended it to become one. The committee met in the back room of the Harlan courthouse, a space that was simultaneously too small and too formal, with 4 committee members seated behind a long table and an audience of valley residents filling the chairs and the standing space along the walls. More people than she'd expected. She scanned the room as she came in and noted Henry Dunmore in the 3rd row, and the Abbotts near the wall, and Ruth Pearson seated near the front with the particular upright posture of a woman who intended to pay close attention. Matilda Crowe was already there. She was seated to the right side with her attorney Fitch, and 2 men Eliza didn't recognize, but who carried themselves like people who were there to be seen rather than to listen. She was dressed, as she had been in Harlan the first time Eliza had seen her, in clothing that announced its expense without appearing to try. She met Eliza's eyes across the room with that same smile that gave nothing away, and Eliza returned it with a neutral look and found her seat. The proceeding ran for 2 hours. Fitch was good. Aldridge had been right about that. He built his argument with a kind of patient confidence that came from having made similar arguments in similar rooms before and understanding how they worked. He questioned the 1879 letter's authority. He raised the 1883 code question. He produced his own survey, a more recent one, that showed the watershed boundaries in a way that supported the Crow water rights claim. He did all of this smoothly and without obvious aggression, which was more effective than aggression would have been. Aldridge dismantled it piece by piece. He was methodical and precise, and he did not raise his voice once, which in Eliza's experience was the mark of an attorney who genuinely believed in what he was arguing rather than one who was compensating for weakness with volume. He addressed the 1883 code with 4 paragraphs of territorial statute that made Fitch's version of that argument look selective. He questioned the methodology of the Crow survey and introduced a signed statement from a registered surveyor in Boise City who had reviewed both surveys and found significant discrepancies in the newer one. When the committee asked questions, Aldridge answered most of them. When one committee member, a man named Brixton who'd been receiving his water through a Crow-adjacent arrangement for 3 years, a fact Jim Pearson had mentioned to Eliza before the meeting, asked about the current financial stability of the Mercer property. Aldridge nodded toward Eliza and she leaned forward and answered the question herself, directly and without hedging. The cattle count, the hay situation, the accounts as they currently stood, the steps they'd taken since February to stabilize. She gave him numbers because numbers were harder to dismiss than impressions. Brixton looked slightly startled to receive an answer that precise from the direction he'd gotten it from. Good, she thought. The committee retired to deliberate. The room reorganized itself into clusters of quiet conversation while they waited, and Eliza sat next to Gideon and did not look at Matilda Crowe and did not speak unless someone spoke to her first. Henry Dunmore came over during the wait. He stood beside them without sitting down, which was a Henry Dunmore thing. The man seemed to have a fundamental mistrust of chairs in formal settings, and said quietly, "Good arguments in there." "Thank you for coming," Gideon said. "I told the Larsons and the Wades," Henry said, "about the Halloran place. What you told me about the pattern." He looked at the committee table. "The Larsons had a fence cut last year. They thought it was weather." Gideon said nothing, but something in his face shifted. "They're willing to make a formal statement," Henry said, "if it comes to that." After Henry went back to his seat, Gideon said nothing for a full minute. Then, "How many people did you talk to about this?" "A few," she said. "When?" "Over the past 2 weeks, while you were working on rebuilding the hay storage." He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read, something layered, containing more than one thing at once. "You didn't tell me," he said, not accusatory, just noting it. I didn't want to raise your expectations before I knew if anyone would actually commit to speaking, she said. The Larsons took some convincing. I imagine they did. A pause. How did you convince them? She considered the question. I told them that a woman who's been doing this for 15 years doesn't stop on her own, she said. She stops when stopping becomes more expensive than continuing. And that doesn't happen until people decide that what she might do to them in the future is less frightening than what she's already done to their neighbors. Gideon was quiet. Your father taught you that? He said. 6 years of land committee meetings, she said. He did. The committee came back after 40 minutes. The chairman, a sun-weathered man named Corbett, who'd served on the committee for 8 years and who Aldridge had described as scrupulously fair to a fault, read the ruling in the flat, declarative tone of a man who'd made a decision he was comfortable with. The Mercer Properties senior water right was confirmed under the original 1879 registration. The Crow Land and Water Company's billing for water access was found to have no valid legal foundation. The committee was referring the matter of the fraudulent billing to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review. The last part was not something Aldridge had told them to expect. Eliza looked at him across the room and he gave her the smallest and most controlled nod she'd ever seen a human being produce. The room had gone to the particular kind of noise that filled a space when a verdict landed and people needed to process it. Eliza looked at the table in front of her and let out a breath she'd been holding since sometime around 6 in the morning. Beside her, Gideon was still. She looked at him. His jaw was tight and his hands on the table were flat and controlled, and he was looking at the middle distance the way he did when he was absorbing something and not ready to speak about it. She put her hand on top of his on the table, just briefly. Not a gesture she'd planned. It happened before she'd decided to do it, which surprised her, and she started to pull it back almost immediately. He turned his hand over under hers and held it there, just for a moment. Then he let go, and she let go, and they both looked forward, and neither of them mentioned it. Across the room, Matilda Crow was speaking in a low, controlled voice to Fitch, her expression giving away nothing, her posture impeccable. But something in the set of her shoulders was different from when she'd walked in, and Eliza knew, with the particular certainty of someone who'd spent 3 months paying close attention to another person's tells, that the woman was calculating losses. Cole Briggs was not in the room. He hadn't been there the whole proceeding, which Eliza had noticed and logged. The man who'd been visible at their fence line twice in the past 2 weeks had chosen not to be visible today. She thought about what that meant and what it would mean when the Territorial Attorney General's office began asking questions, and what a man in Cole Briggs's position might decide to do when the landscape shifted under him. She thought, it's not over. But something else was different now, and she knew it even before they'd stood up from their chairs. The room knew it too, in the way rooms knew things. Through posture and eye contact, and the quality of the silence that had settled in the place where the noise had been. The people who'd shown up today had seen something, and what they'd seen would travel, the way everything traveled in a valley where people had long memories and long winters and not much else to think about. They walked out of the courthouse into the thin March snow, and Henry Dunmore held the door, and Margaret Abbott touched Eliza's arm as she passed, and Tom Abbott shook Gideon's hand with the grip of a man who meant it. Eliza turned up her collar against the cold and kept walking. There was still a barn to finish rebuilding, still a herd to manage through the end of winter, still a march that hadn't finished being March. But the ground beneath her feet today felt different. Cole Briggs confessed on a Thursday. It didn't happen the way Eliza had imagined it might. Not in a courtroom, not with the kind of formal drama that made things feel conclusive and complete. It happened in a small office in Harlan, in the presence of a territorial deputy named Walsh and Aldridge, and a stenographer who typed everything down with the expressionless efficiency of someone whose job required them to hear difficult things without reacting to them. Eliza wasn't in the room. She heard about it from Aldridge the following day, who rode out to the ranch specifically to deliver the information in person, which told her it was significant before he'd said a word. He gave a full account, Aldridge said. He was at their table, the same table where they'd spread the old survey documents in November, which felt like a long time ago now. The fire. 2 fence incidents on the Halloran property in 2088. A hay storage fire on a property called the Wade parcel 2 years back, which the Wades had attributed to an accident. He paused. all on Matilda Crow's instruction, all in the context of properties that had water rights disputes with her holdings. She instructed him directly, Gideon said. In writing, on 2 occasions, Aldridge said, which is, frankly, a level of documentation I did not expect. Briggs had kept the letters, I suspect as insurance. The room was quiet. Why did he talk? Eliza asked. Aldridge looked at her over his glasses. Because the Attorney General's inquiry made it clear that the choice was between talking now on his own terms or being found out later on someone else's. Briggs is many things, but he's not a man who'll take a fall for someone who can't protect him anymore. He folded his hands on the table. With the committee ruling and the referral, Matilda Crow's ability to protect anyone, including herself, has become substantially limited. The consequences unfolded over the following 6 weeks, with the kind of institutional slowness that legal processes always had, and that was maddening if you tried to watch it too closely. Eliza made a deliberate choice not to watch it too closely. There was enough to do on the ranch that she couldn't afford to spend her attention on a process she couldn't speed up. The Crow Land and Water Company's billing arrangements with 4 other properties in the valley were suspended pending review. 2 of those properties, including the surviving members of the Larson family, filed formal complaints that were added to the inquiry. The fraudulent survey that Fitch had presented at the committee meeting became a separate matter, with the surveyor who'd signed it eventually admitting that he'd been paid to alter the boundary measurements. Matilda Crow hired 3 attorneys and gave no public statements. It was Henry Dunmore who told them, one afternoon in late March, while helping with the new hay barn framing, that word around Harlan was that Crow was already in negotiations to sell 2 of her valley parcels. That her land holdings in the territory, which had been built on a foundation that included several fraudulent water rights arrangements, were contracting in the way that structures contracted when you pulled out the pieces that weren't supposed to be there. She's not going to prison, Henry said. He drove a nail with the matter-of-fact energy of a man stating a weather forecast. She's too rich and too careful for that, but she's going to lose a lot of what she spent 15 years building. That's enough, Gideon said. Henry looked at him. It is, Eliza said. It's enough. And she meant it, which was something she'd had to arrive at rather than something she'd assumed from the start. She'd spent enough time in those months thinking about Matilda Crow, running through the evidence, tracking the patterns, building the case, that there was a version of herself that had gotten invested in the idea of a complete and satisfying defeat. A prison sentence, a public humiliation, something that looked like justice the way people imagined justice when they hadn't yet had to deal with how messy and incomplete it usually was in practice. But the hay barn was being rebuilt. The water rights were confirmed. The billing was stopped. The pattern had been exposed, and the other families who'd been caught in it had been given a path to reclaim what they'd lost, or at least to stop losing more. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. Cole Briggs left the territory in April. No one saw him go. He was simply 1 week, not there anymore, which was the kind of exit that people who understood the frontier made when they understood that staying had stopped being viable. The new hay barn went up over 2 weekends in late March. Built with lumber from Dunmore's surplus and labor from the Abbotts and the Pearsons and the Larsons and Henry Dunmore himself, who had the particular skill of making a communal work project feel efficient rather than chaotic. Eliza cooked for all of them both weekends, which was an enormous amount of work and which she did without complaining, fueled partly by genuine gratitude and partly by the specific competitiveness of a woman who'd told people she could handle a frontier homestead and intended to demonstrate it unambiguously. On the second Sunday, when the roof was going on and the smell of new wood was everywhere and the day had gone warm enough that coats were unnecessary, Margaret Abbott came and stood beside her while she was stirring a pot over the outdoor fire and said, "You know what people are saying now, don't you?" "Probably several things," Eliza said. "They're saying that Gideon Mercer finally got some sense," Margaret said, with a warmth in her voice that took some of the edge off the bluntness. "And that whoever that woman is who came up from Boise City with a letter, she's the reason this property is still standing." Eliza kept stirring. "My father's the reason," she said. "He knew what he was doing when he wrote that letter." "Sure," Margaret said in a tone that was agreeable without being convinced. "Your father had good judgment." A pause. "So do you." It was in the evenings, in those late March weeks when the daylight started to stretch, and the ice on the creek was thinning, and the world outside had that particular quality of something releasing after a long time of being held. It was in those evenings that something began to shift between Eliza and Gideon in a way that was different from the practical shifts that had been happening since November. It wasn't sudden. Nothing between them had ever been sudden, which she supposed was appropriate for two people who'd approached the whole arrangement the way you approached a creek crossing in early thaw, carefully, testing the weight of each step before committing to it. It showed up in small things first. He started talking more at supper. Not dramatically more, not overnight, but she noticed the incremental change, the way you notice temperature. You didn't register each individual degree, but at some point you realized the air was different than it had been. He told her things about the ranch's history that he'd never mentioned before, about the first winter, and a horse he'd had that had died in a storm, and a neighbor from the early years who'd helped him build the main cabin and then moved on to Montana and whom he'd never heard from again. She told him things, too, about her father's land committee work and the arguments she'd overheard through doorways when she was 12 years old, about the particular kind of loneliness of being a capable woman in a territory that wasn't always sure what to do with capable women, about the 3 days of riding with the letter in her pocket and the specific fear that had been underneath the practical fear, not the fear of arriving at a stranger's property alone, but the fear that the stranger would turn her away and she'd have nowhere left to go. "I almost didn't knock," she said. This was a Tuesday evening in April, the fire low, the window showing the last of a pale gold sunset. "When I rode into your clearing and saw the cabin, I sat on that horse for a full minute thinking about what I'd say if you just didn't want to hear it." "What did you decide?" he said. "That I'd come too far to make a polite retreat," she said, "and that my horse was done for the day regardless." The corner of his mouth pulled, which by now she knew well enough to interpret accurately. "I was going to send you away," he said. She looked at him. "I know. If the letter had been from anyone else." He was looking at the fire. "If your father hadn't—" He stopped. Edmund Hartwell was the kind of man who didn't ask for things lightly. In 9 years of knowing him, I never heard him ask for a personal favor. Not once. He paused. "When I read that letter, I understood that he knew he was dying and that this was the last thing he was going to ask of anyone, and he spent that asking on you." He looked at her then. "That told me what you were before you'd said 10 words. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "What did it tell you?" she said. "That someone who'd raised Edmund Hartwell's loyalty that completely was worth the risk of an open door," he said. She looked at her hands. Out the window at the last strip of gold above the tree line. Back at him. "I'm not what he described in the letter," she said. "I don't think I'm easy to live with. I take over things without asking. I have opinions about everything, and I don't keep them to myself as much as I probably should. I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not a tidy arrangement." "No," he agreed. "You're not." "You're not either," she said. "You make decisions alone as a reflex. You don't talk about what's actually bothering you until it's been bothering you for weeks. You—" "Eliza." She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the controlled look, not the careful look, not any of the looks she'd catalogued over the winter. Something more direct than those, and more uncertain, and more real for the uncertainty. "I know what I am," he said. "I'm not asking you to pretend I'm easier than I am." A pause. The fire shifted. "I'm asking if you think what we are together is better than what we were separately." The question was simple and enormous at the same time, and she sat with it for a moment before answering because it deserved more than a reflexive response. She thought about the account ledger in November and the fence post in the snow and the night of the fire when they'd worked in silence for 2 hours without either of them suggesting they stop. She thought about the hand on the table in the courthouse and the way he'd turned his over. She thought about her father's letter and the specific wisdom it contained. Not the wisdom of a man doing a final romantic gesture, but the wisdom of a man who'd paid attention for years and understood something about 2 particular people that those people hadn't yet understood about themselves. "Yes," she said. "I do." He nodded slowly. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no declarations, no sudden warmth that swept through the room. He just nodded, and the fire burned down a little further, and outside the last light left the sky, and neither of them moved to make it into something larger than it was. Some things didn't need to be made larger. Spring arrived the way it always arrived on that piece of frontier land. not all at once, but in installments, each one a little more convincing than the last. The creek ran high and cold with snowmelt. The east pasture came back green in patches, tentative at first, and then with real commitment. The cattle, which had come through the winter leaner than Eliza would have liked but alive and sound, moved into the pasture on the first good morning and stood in the new grass with the stunned satisfaction of animals who'd forgotten that ground could be soft. Eliza planted the garden in April, reclaiming the abandoned plot behind the cabin that she'd identified in her first week on the property. It was harder work than she'd expected. The soil was compacted from a year of neglect and still cold, and it took 4 days of work in pieces between other tasks before she had it turned and seeded the way she wanted it. Gideon, without being asked, built a low fence around it to keep the chickens out, which was a practical thing and also something that required him to spend half a Sunday on a project that wasn't strictly necessary, and she thought about that while she was washing the dirt off her hands at the pump and felt something she recognized, finally, as a simple and uncomplicated gladness. It was complicated, their life. The ranch was still operating on margins that required constant attention. The rebuilding had cost more than they'd recovered from the cattle sale, and the legal work with Aldridge hadn't been free, and there would be lean months ahead before the operation was genuinely stable. Gideon still made decisions alone sometimes, out of reflex, and she still took over projects without announcing she was doing it, and they still had the occasional conversation that landed badly and required a day's processing before either of them could approach it again. None of that was fixed. Probably none of it would ever be entirely fixed. But in May, when Frank Halloran wrote back from Oregon in response to Jim Pearson's letter, a long, careful letter that detailed everything he'd experienced before leaving the valley, and that committed to providing a sworn statement for the territorial inquiry, Eliza sat at the table and read it 3 times, and then walked out to where Gideon was working on the new barn's interior fittings and handed it to him without saying anything. He read it standing up, the way he read things he was invested in. She watched his face. When he finished, he looked up at the hills beyond the tree line. The May light was doing something particular with the new leaves on the aspens, and the air had that smell it only had in early spring on high ground, cold and green and alive. "He can come back," Gideon said, "the Halloran property. If the fraudulent arrangements are unwound, the sale—" "Aldridge thinks it can be challenged," Eliza said. "The sale price was so far below market, and the circumstances so tied to the Crow harassment, that there may be grounds to contest it. It won't be fast." "No," he said, "but it's possible." "It's possible," she said. He handed the letter back. His fingers brushed hers when she took it, briefly, and neither of them commented on this, which was itself a kind of language. The Valley dinner happened in June, on a Saturday, which was Margaret Abbott's idea, and which she organized with the efficient warmth of a woman who was very good at gathering people. It was held at the Abbott property, which had the most space, and it brought together 9 families from the surrounding area, more people than Eliza had seen in one place since Boise City, and a very different gathering than the courthouse had been. Gideon did not want to go. He told her this plainly 2 days before, in the way he stated things he expected her to disagree with. "I know," she said. "Go anyway." He looked at her. "It matters," she said. "Not for politics, for the actual thing, the being known by people. You've been a name in this valley for 9 years. You should be a person." "I'm not comfortable with that kind of—" "I know you're not," she said. "Go anyway." He went. And it was not a triumph for him in the way it might have been for someone else. He didn't transform, didn't suddenly become a man who moved easily in company. He stood too long at the edges of conversations and spoke too little and looked occasionally like he was calculating the distance to the horses. But he shook hands, and he answered questions that were asked directly, and he ate the food, and he stayed until the gathering was winding down. And when Henry Dunmore's oldest boy, 16, big for his age, painfully shy in the way that large teenage boys often were, got pulled into a conversation about cattle management and started to visibly panic, Gideon stepped in beside him and took the conversational weight of it, matter-of-factly, without drawing attention to what he was doing. Eliza saw this from across the yard. She thought, there he is? Not the man people had been afraid of, not the man who'd been described in whispered stories around bunkhouses. The man who pulled someone out of a situation because someone had once done the same for him, and who never stopped understanding what that meant. She thought about her father, who had known this, who had seen it from a distance for years and had banked on it in his final letter, with the specific faith of a man who paid attention to what people actually did rather than what was said about them. She was glad, she realized, not qualified glad, not glad with reservations, just glad that the horse had nearly given out on the second day and that she'd walked the last 4 miles, and that she'd knocked on the door of a cabin owned by a man most people avoided because her father had made her promise to look him in the eye when she gave him the letter. She was glad for all of it, even the parts that had been genuinely hard. On the ride home, they took the long way. Gideon's choice, which surprised her until she understood that he'd spent most of the afternoon in company and needed the additional hour of open air and movement before closing himself back into walls. The evening was warm, the first real warmth of the season, and the light was still good at 8 o'clock. The sky, the particular shade of clear blue that only appeared for about 3 weeks in early summer at this elevation before the heat changed it. The creek was audible in the distance, running full and fast on the snowmelt. "Margaret Abbott asked me something," Gideon said. They were riding side by side on a road wide enough to accommodate it. "What?" She asked if we were happy. He said it in the neutral, reporting tone he used for facts. I didn't know what to say. Eliza looked at the road ahead. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said I'd have to think about it." A pause. She said that was probably the most honest answer she'd gotten from anyone all year. Eliza almost laughed. She contained most of it, but some of it escaped, and Gideon glanced at her sideways. "She's not wrong," Eliza said. "It is honest." "Are you?" he said. "Happy." She thought about the question the way she thought about most questions from him, as something that deserved a real answer rather than a reflexive one. "I don't know if happy is the right word," she said. "Happy sounds like something that just happens to you, and you wait around for it. What I feel is more like," she tried to find it, "like I'm doing the right things, the hard right things, not the easy wrong ones, and that I'm doing them with someone I trust." She paused. "That's better than happy. Happy is temporary. What I'm describing lasts." Gideon was quiet for a while. "Yes," he said eventually. "That's..." He seemed to run out of words and not be troubled by it. "Yes." The ranch came through the tree line ahead of them, and the cabin was there with the window catching the last of the light, and the new barn beside it was still pale with new lumber, not yet weathered into the gray that the old one had been. Give it a few years, and you wouldn't be able to tell it was new. The land had a way of absorbing the new things until they looked like they'd always been there. The garden behind the cabin was coming up. She could see the tops of the early greens from here, a thin green fuzz against the dark soil that she'd been watching every morning the way you watch something you'd worked for and needed to actually appear. It had appeared. Gideon opened the gate when they reached the property line. She rode through, and he followed, and he latched it behind them the way he always latched it, firmly, checking it twice, because that was who he was. A man who checked things twice. Who closed what needed closing and stayed where he planted himself, and took a debt seriously enough to turn it into something neither person had entirely anticipated. She dismounted in the yard and led her horse toward the barn, and the evening air was warm, and somewhere in the new hay barn, a cat that had appeared sometime in March and made itself at home without asking anyone's permission made a sound and then went quiet. There were no lessons she could have articulated cleanly from what had happened since October. Life wasn't organized that way, and she'd always been suspicious of people who wrapped their hardest years into neat conclusions. What she knew was smaller and more specific than a lesson. She knew that her father had understood something she hadn't yet understood about herself when he'd written that letter. That there was a kind of courage that wasn't the loud or obvious kind, not the courage of running toward a fire, though she'd done that too, but the courage of staying with something difficult and complicated and uncertain because you'd decided it was worth the difficulty. She knew that a man who'd spent 9 years fighting for a piece of land alone, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, had turned out to be exactly the kind of person you wanted beside you when the fight got bigger than either of you had planned for. And she knew that trust, on the frontier and probably everywhere else, wasn't something that arrived whole. It was something you built out of the accumulated small evidence of a person doing what they said they'd do, in the cold and the dark and the ordinary mornings, until one day you realized you weren't watching for the evidence anymore. You just stopped being afraid. She unsaddled her horse in the new barn, in the clean smell of fresh lumber and hay, and hung the saddle on the proper peg and checked the water. And by the time she came back out into the warm June evening, Gideon had already started the fire inside. The light in the window was on. She walked toward it,